What is known about the sexual predilections of the men and women of ancient Rome? What were their attitudes to extramarital intimacy and same-sex relationships? And how scandalous were the Roman emperors? Let's step inside the Roman bedroom and reveal how, right from the start, it was linked to momentous constitutional development for the Roman state.
There were a lot of slaves throughout the Roman Empire. Since there were nearly equal numbers of slaves and free men, slavery was a defining feature of Roman society. Roman slaves' experiences varied widely according on the duties they were given and the whims of their owners. Gladiators might be slaves. They worked as potters, managers, mine workers, soil tillers, and more commonly, they slept in the attic or kitchen hallway on a pile of straw covered with a blanket. Often, attractive female slaves were compelled to give in to their masters' private fantasies. Sometimes, out of mistrust or envy, mistresses would make life especially difficult for female slaves. The satirical poet tells the tale of Pescus, a female slave who was frequently beaten by her mistress because the latter thought she was attending to her husband's private affairs. Roman slaves had no legal rights. Although they may form family-like groups, they were not allowed to marry. The master, however, had the authority to sell people or split up couples as he saw fit. Children born into slave households were regarded as the property of their masters and might be sold or taken away from their thugs. The social fabric of Rome was heavily influenced by sexuality. Historical accounts of early Rome, particularly before it became a republic, suggest that it functioned almost as a nation of thugs. Romans often expanded their territory by targeting neighboring city-states and seizing what they desired, including people. One infamous example occurred in 750 BE when Romans abducted women from neighboring Sabine tribes to boost their population. This event contributed to Rome's reputation as a cultural melting pot. Men in ancient Rome were free to engage in same-gender relationships, but with so that avoided clouding judgment, the Stoics also emphasized the equality of all people, including slaves and women, insisting that intimate acts should not infringe upon initiators, as top-tier entertainers were highly desirable partners for many Romans. Many couples in Rome adopted a flexible approach to their relationships, often including others of any gender as long as family stability was maintained. Their fame frequently led to encounters like discreet affairs with the wives of prominent figures. These relationships occasionally caused scandals. One prominent example is the wife of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who allegedly sought intimacy with gladiators. Legend has it that her husband sought advice from an oracle regarding her behavior. Roman men were even encouraged to have intimate relations with their slaves. Emperor Hadrian was known for his polysexual activities, often unknown to his wife Vivia Sabina. Hadrian's most famous relationship was with a teenage boy named Antinous. After Antinous' death, Hadrian was so grief-stricken that he declared the boy a god and mandated his worship throughout the empire as a cornerstone of Rome's faith. During pagan times, it was the Vestal virgins who tended the temple of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. These women were considered divine overseers of Rome's security under the eyes of the gods chosen between the ages of 6 and 10. They served for 30 years, during which they were required to remain celibate.
Emperors frequently disregarded the stringent prohibition that all Roman men were not allowed to have intimacy with the Vestal virgins. For example, Emperor Elagabalus's attempt to have divine children by marrying a Vestal virgin did nothing to repair his damaged reputation. In ancient Rome, night workers known as soil doves were men of any social standing who were legally permitted to engage in intimate relations with them, regardless of their gender, without fear of moral condemnation, as long as they were restrained and showed self-control.
Roman culture relied heavily on brothels. Late in Roman history, a precise legal definition of a prostitute was established. characterizing such an individual as someone who engaged in intimate promiscuity and was compensated. However, promiscuity, rather than monetary soil, was the focus. The majority of these laborers were slaves or former slaves, and some of them were allowed to keep a percentage of their profits. It was thought that their actions were motivated by excessive desires or avarice. The range of service prices was 1 to 25 asses. An ordinary Roman coin was worth around 10 asses each day, which was almost twice what one could make from a day's work in Pompeii. It's still unknown what services were offered specifically and what the women's status was. High-class professionals had no obvious upper limit, while the lowest wages for undefined services were negligible, according to the poet Lilius. A recurrent trope in Roman literature is the generous, which is said to have been the foundation of the dictator's fortune through a high-class prostitute's bequest. Returning to the myth of Rome's foundation, when Arena gained land for the Romans during her years as a merix, most merits historically made little money in comparison to their pimps. Soil endures substandard living circumstances, as evidenced by the city's only known surviving brothel. Freeborn Romans were allowed to take advantage of their slaves regardless of their age or place of birth, without incurring legal repercussions. A slave had no control over their body and no civic protection. The body of a slave was therefore viewed as a means of gratifying the needs of their masters. Sexual relations with soil doves or slaves were acceptable in Roman society, provided the freeborn citizen took the dominant role. However, freeborn men who willingly assumed passive roles known as sunedi risked legal repercussions under Lex Scantinia. This Roman law penalized high-standing male citizens for engaging in submissive behavior, as it was viewed as undermining masculinity and associating them with femininity. The Romans opposed the idea of their citizens being penetrated, associating it with traits of the lower class and enslaved individuals. Cato the Elder openly criticized intimacy that he believed made Roman men effeminate, deeming it disgraceful despite the fact that Roman men commonly engaged in relations with other males, as long as they were the dominant partner. Such encounters often occurred in public baths where men and women bathed separately. It is likely that male soil also participated in these bathhouses. Soldiers, too, were legally permitted to force themselves on unwilling slaves, while assaulting a freeborn Roman woman was heavily punished. Slaves had no such protections during military campaigns. Roman emperors' soldiers were frequently rewarded with plunder, which included humans they could use as they pleased. Conquered people were either sold for cash or used by the soldiers themselves. Roman emperors were known for their excessive sexual behavior. For instance, it is said that Emperor Nero transformed a man into a eunuch and wed him because he looked like his late wife, whom Nero had killed. Emperor Caligula kidnapped women, had affairs with his sisters, and threw wild parties, but most of all, the Roman soldier was a man like all men, and he needed the greatest kind of company. Contented by a female, men were expected to serve in the Roman army. Although all soldiers were men during the glory days of the Imperium, recent archaeological evidence indicates that a limited number of women may have served as limited military soldiers in the late Roman army. Despite being surrounded by vast numbers of his fellow humans during his career, a Roman soldier's job was probably lonely when it came to romantic love. This is because he was prohibited from getting married from the start of the Christian era. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that a small number of women may have joined the ranks of the late Roman army, serving as limitan militia soldiers, but in the glory days of the Imperium, all soldiers were men. Though a Roman soldier spent his entire career surrounded by huge masses of his fellow human beings, when it came to romantic love, his profession was likely to be a lonely one. That's because from around the beginning of the Christian era, he was not allowed to marry. It could be said that the first Roman Emperor Augustus finished the drawn-out process of transforming Rome's army into a fully professional force, with ranks populated by career soldiers and men who gave the prime of their lives to fighting and toiling for the peace of the empire. Roman men were free to have sex with males of lower status, without a perceived loss of masculinity or even as an enhancement of it. However, Those who took the receiving role in sex acts, sometimes referred to as the passive or submissive role, were disparaged as weak and effeminate regardless of the sex of their partner, while having sex with males in the active position was proof of one's masculinity. Latin had many terms for men who did not conform to the masculine norm, and one of the most important aspects of a citizen's political liberty was mastery of one's own body. Using one's body to give pleasure to others, whether in heterosexual or homosexual relationships, was considered servile law, such as the poorly understood lex scania, and various pieces of Augustan moral legislation sought to restrict same-sex activity among freeborn males, as it was viewed as a threat to a man's status and independence as a citizen. Some scholars argue this indicates the existence of a homosexual subculture in Rome, although there are no straightforward Latin equivalent literary sources that reveal patterns of behavior among a minority of free men that suggest same-sex preferences or orientations. Some terms, such as exiles, specifically referred to adult Romans who did not confine their same intimate relationships to male adult workers or slaves. The satire, for example, describes adult, free men showing intimate interest in one another. Some older men may have at times preferred the passive role with partners of the same age or younger, though this was socially frowned upon. Roman ideals of masculinity were premised on taking an active role, as Williams noted, which was the prime directive of masculine intimate behavior for Romans. This emphasis on dominance reflected the hierarchical, patriarchal structure of Roman society. A conquest mentality formed part of a cult of vil that particularly shaped Roman homosexual practices. Roman soldiers occupied a unique position in society akin to that of adult workers on the social ladder, despite their bravery and fame in battle. Roman society regarded soldiers as little more than laborers paid and revered for their willingness to risk their lives, but socially marginally, hiring a soldier as a bodyguard was common as having a trained warrior for protection made practical sense. This could also be a lucrative endeavor for soldiers. Despite their marginal status, gladiators were nevertheless occasionally used to keep troops disciplined or to defend elite Romans. Because they were expected to take advantage of opportunities for carnal pleasure, which some may have found desirable, soldiers frequently viewed their sexual options as a benefit of their jobs. Castration and circumcision were viewed by the Romans and Greeks as barbarous mutilations of male genitalia. The traditional unism of the cult of Cybele was limited to foreign priests when it was brought to Rome in the 3rd century BCE. However, the Galli Roman people followed their own traditions and established sodalities to carry out honors according to Roman conventions. In addition to the Jewish practice of circumcision, some have contended that the Apostle Paul's advice to the Galatians not to get circumcised should also be seen in the context of the ceremonial castration of Sila, whose cult was based among Jews in Galatia. The Abrahamic covenant dispersion was characterized by circumcision. Jews circumcised not just Jewish male babies, but also adult male converts and their male slaves. Greco-Roman authors reported circumcision among peoples they described as Arab, but they thought the practice originated in Egypt, even though they saw it as a distinguishing feature of Jews. Ethiopian and Syrian Phoenician Kulan, the bizarre family and asexual rituals of the Persians, who retain their lineage by having children with their mothers, and the Massage, who devour their fathers, are linked by the Neoplatonic philosopher Celsus to circumcision. Alex Cornelia outlawed castration and other forms of mutilation during the Republican era. Despite these prohibitions, some Romans kept beautiful male slaves known as delici or delictois, delights who were sometimes castrated to preserve the androgynous looks of their youth. The Emperor Nero had his freedman Spurius castrated and married him in a public ceremony. By the end of the 1st century, bans against castration had been enacted by the emperors Domitian, and Nerva addressed a burgeoning trade in eunuch slaves sometime between 128 and 132. Adrian appears to have temporarily banned circumcision on pain of death. Antoninus Pius later exempted Jews from this ban along with Egyptian priests according to Origen. By his time, only Jews were permitted to practice circumcision legislation. Circumcision became a capital punishment under Constantine, the first Christian emperor, who in 339 released all slaves who had undergone the procedure. It was believed that men were weakened by frequent ejaculation. In the 21st century, Greek medical ideas based on classical elements and humors advised avoiding foods that cause flatulence and decreasing semen production with cooling, drying and astringent therapies such as cold baths. In his treatise on intimacy, Galen, a medical writer, described Sean as a mixture of blood that was originally thought to be a humor required for organ function. It was created inside the man's coiled spermatic veins and turned white when heated as it entered the testicles. Galen cautioned that health and energy are lost with moderate intimate activity. Excessive pleasure can dissolve the vital tone of the body and, in certain cases, even cause death, he said. It was believed that the unchecked spread of pneuma in semen resulted in a loss of masculinity, mental clarity, physical vigor, and a powerful, manly voice, a complaint also mentioned in the Priya actors, and singers were infibulated to maintain their vocal quality because it was thought that intimate activity had a special effect on the voice. Quintilian suggested that in order to develop a deep, male voice for the court, orators should refrain from having intimacy. Calvis, a poet and orator from the 1st century BC who claimed to have slept with lead plates over his kidneys to prevent wet dreams, was a close friend of Catullus and expressed this worry. These plates, by suppressing sexual desire and preventing nocturnal discharges, cooling was believed to preserve physical strength for intellectual pursuits. Hair removal and cupping therapy were also used as treatments for sexual diseases such as psoriasis and hypersexuality, priapism, prolonged erections without desire, and involuntary semen discharge. Men who had been forced to do intimacy were exempt from the loss of legal or social standing suffered by males who prostituted themselves or willingly took the receiving role in intimacy, according to the jurist Pomponius, a man forced, whether by robbers or the enemy, in wartime, 6 predum vel hostium. Bore no stigma. Fears of mass rape following military defeat extended to both male and female potential victims. Roman law addressed the forcing of a male citizen as early as the 2nd century BC, when a ruling was issued in a case possibly involving a same-gender incident, even men disreputable for their morals. More suspicious were granted the same right as other free men to protect their bodies from forced intimacy. In a treatise from the early 1st century BC, the forcing of intimacy of a freeborn male was equated with that of a mater family and considered a capital crime. Forced intimacy was defined as intimacy against a boy, a woman, or anyone in the Lex Julia 2:6, Publica, which was written in the early 3rd century AD, but probably dates to Julius Caesar's rule. These people faced execution, which was an uncommon punishment under Roman law. Abducting a freeborn boy for sex or bribing the beauve chaperon, who comes for the opportunity, was a deadly offense. Several laws allow for the prosecution of a careless chaperone, shifting the guilt from the victim to those who failed in their duties as guardians. Even while the law acknowledged the victims, the defense's blamelessness speech suggests that jurors' perceptions of blame could be manipulated. Along with parricide, one of the worst crimes that could be committed in Rome was the forcing of a clever freeborn person. Though it may have happened more in revenge fantasies than in reality, forcing a female virgin and looting a temple were also customary punishments meted out to a male adulterer by the wronged spouse. Roman soldiers were required to exercise self-control when it came to intimacy, just like any other free and respectable Roman male of position. Soldiers convicted of adultery were given dishonorable discharges, and convicted adulterers were barred from enlisting. Strict commanders might ban prostitutes and pimps from the camp. However, the Roman army, whether on the march or stationed in permanent forts, was typically attended by a number of camp followers, including prostitutes. Their presence was usually taken for granted but mentioned when it became a problem. For example, CIO Imanes, when setting out for Nancha in 133 BC, dismissed the camp followers as part of his efforts to restore discipline. The marriage ban applied to all ranks up to Centurion 8, though men of the governing classes were exempt by the 2nd century, and the stability of the empire kept most units in permanent forts, leading to attachments with local women. After troops were discharged, their emotional importance was acknowledged, despite the fact that these partnerships could not legally be recognized as marriages. In addition to being able to legally marry as citizens, the couple's children were also automatically granted citizenship. The usage of male slaves was one of the other ways that soldiers may enjoy intimate pleasure. War rape and homosexual same-gender relationships. Soldier behavior was severely penalized and infractions were punishable by death. Self-control. According to Polius, a historian from the 2nd century BC, same-gender activities in the military were punishable by fusarium clubbing to death. He also noted that a soldier upheld his masculinity by refusing to allow his body to be used for intimate purposes, and that having intimacy with fellow soldiers went against the Roman taboo against having intimacy with another freeborn male. The most obvious contrast between this physical integrity and the restrictions on a soldier's independence inside the military hierarchy was this. The only citizens routinely subjected to corporal punishment, a practice typically reserved for slaves, were Roman soldiers. Since sexually degrading one's body may represent loss in combat, sexual integrity also served to differentiate the soldier position. Ideally, a Roman soldier would avoid amorous or personal connections. Celibacy was not strictly enforced throughout the war, and many men had some kind of lady in their lives, but it was thought that disgruntled soldiers were more combative and active in battle. According to epigraphic evidence, some soldiers married in violation of Augustus's prohibition on marriage, running the risk of unintended effects. Common law spouses of many soldiers may have been citizens they met during battles, Roman ladies by birth, or slave girls. Female slaves and prisoners were frequently used by soldiers as companions or intimate partners. There were also official military courtiers, however, not much is known about them. Most of them were undoubtedly prisoners from provinces that had been overrun, and their standard of living was probably appalling. Similar to service in the thoughts of male POWs, being placed in a military brothel was equivalent to a death sentence. Captives captured during the Dacian Wars or the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD might have faced this fate. In friendly areas, both free and enslaved people usually followed in the baggage train while a Roman legion was on the march 30 years later. Even though the women in a soldier's life were typically slaves, military courtiers probably worked there as well. Non-combatants frequently established their own camps outside the legionary castrum. These civilian settlements are known as carbi. These settlements included women who provided soldiers with necessities like clothing repairs. Barbarian prisoners known as courtis were frequently assimilated into Roman society. Many of them picked up Latin and Roman etiquette. Roman warriors were typically devoted to these women after falling in love with them. According to 2nd century epigraphic evidence, soldiers would capture or purchase their future brides during times of war and then marry them after their service was over. The charge certificate of a British Celt named Lucius, who enlisted in an auxiliary cohort around 85 AD, is one example of how tombstones show that some slave females who lived as common law wives truly lamented the death of their army husbands who had served as their defenders. Reveals under trans reign marriage for soldiers. He had 3 children with a local girl named Tacela, all of whom were granted Roman citizenship. Under Septimus Severus's reforms, Roman warriors were first permitted to get married, which recognized the importance of family life for soldiers and made the army less regimented overall. Roman soldiers' personal liberties and military policy underwent a dramatic adjustment as a result of these modifications. After that, a growing number of inscriptions mentioned soldiers' wives, with some referring to them as mistresses and slaves. At least one soldier buried his wife, while several servicemen were buried by their spouses at Palmyra, Syria. In Palmyra, for example, the centurion Probia Sanctus buried his incomparable and well-deserving wife Antonia Cara, who had passed away at the age of 20, possibly from the plague. The ban remained in effect from Augustus's reign until Septimius Severus overturned it. Even so, the prohibition did little to stop soldiers from forming relationships with women. The ideal age for recruits into the Roman army was 17 or 18. While most civilians in the empire married between the ages of 15 and 20, consequently, many young recruits would not have had serious relationship commitments before joining the legions. Except during times of extreme crisis, the Romans rarely conscripted soldiers. The emphasis on men in their teens or early 20s persisted even throughout conscription. As a result, the majority of men who enlisted later in life were eager volunteers, sometimes having never married in the first place, losing a wife, or being expelled from their houses. Not everyone who wanted to serve in the military could join one of Rome's legions. A lengthy list of qualifications had to be fulfilled by potential recruits. The first was being a true Roman citizen, but all free men eventually received Roman citizenship. For the most of Rome's existence, only citizens who were fully Roman were eligible to enlist in the legions. Auxiliary troops could include members of lower citizenship classes, such as those from conquered areas. Instead, Roman citizens could also join auxiliary units if the regular legions were not accepting recruits at the time. Besides being full Roman citizens, recruits could not be married. However, this did not stop some unhappily married men from running away and joining a legion, which was considered an immediate declaration of divorce. Recruits also needed to be healthy and come from favorable trades. Professions like butchers, blacksmiths, and reapers were especially desirable because these trades produced physically strong individuals accustomed to working with their hands. Speaking of hands, recruits were required to have all their fingers and thumbs. Missing an index finger or thumb would often be grounds for denial because gripping a sword and shield without them was much harder, potentially making the soldier a liability. Lastly, a prospective legionnaire needed a full set of male genitalia. However, due to recruiting challenges, the rules were later relaxed, allowing men with only one testicle to enlist. Legionnaires were relatively tall for their time to be considered fit for military service. Recruits needed to be at least 5 Roman feet and 10 in tall. A Roman foot was about 1/3 of an inch shorter than a modern US foot. This means recruits needed to be at least 5'8" in by today's standards, unless they were exceptionally stocky. Rome's legions did not accept hardcore criminals, while individuals with petty criminal backgrounds could find a fresh start in the legions. Those attempting to flee exile or prosecution for significant crimes were prohibited from enlisting. If they did, they would be turned over to authorities without contemporary background checks. In addition to being rejected, Roman officers evaluated recruits based on character references, providing at least one letter of reference confirming the recruit's character and capability as a soldier was one of the final requirements for joining a legion. Veteran soldiers' letters were the most important, and suggestions from people who had been in the coveted legion were very helpful. Following initial screening by a recruiting officer, recruits underwent a final test known as the probatio, which is an interview with legionary officers. If accepted, the recruit immediately took the military oath, officially becoming a soldier of Rome. New soldiers are typically reported to their cohort commanders, who record their information in the unit's muster rolls. Their name, height, age, eye and hair colors, and scars were all included. Tattoos, marks, and other distinguishing characteristics. Tracking deserters or identifying remains after fights were made easier with this knowledge. The Roman army frequently covered the cost of recruits' transportation if they were recruited far from the base of their cohort. Transportation expenses were shared when several recruits were enlisted at once, and any remaining monies were transferred to their accounts. When traveling alone, recruits may spend the funds on personal costs. They discovered the legion's organizational structure when they reached their recruits. By the late Republican imperial period, legions had 10 cohorts, each with roughly 480 soldiers, whereas during the Republican period, They were split up into 10 maniples, each with about 120 men divided into 3 ranks. The first cohort was often over strength, comprising 800 men, and the rest of the personnel included cooks, blacksmiths, and other support staff. Most legions struggled to maintain their target strength of 6,000 personnel, often operating below this number. After induction, soldiers committed to a 25-year enlistment. Upon retirement, veterans received payments in land or cash, a policy formalized during the reign of Augustus with the creation of the military treasury. Each legion had its own unique identity, shaped by its station and history. Units annihilated or disgraced, such as the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions, were destroyed at the Battle of the Cherbourg Forest in 9 AD. It was removed from standard naming conventions and never reconstituted. A 2-in-1/2T shaft of soft iron with a triangular tip was attached at the end of the shaft, with the iron shaft being much thinner than the wooden part of the pilum. Sometimes a lead weight was added near the wooden shaft's end. The pilum was designed as an expendable long-range weapon that could not be thrown. Once embedded in an enemy shield, it rendered the shield was useless until it was pulled out. If a legionnaire missed and the pilum hit the ground, it would shatter, or its metal shaft would bend, making it unusable again. Armor and flesh may be penetrated by the weapon if it hit a human. Along with armor and weaponry, Roman troops also carried a range of tools and personal gear for use in the field. Soldiers were supposed to carry a large portion of their own belongings under Marius's reforms. This reduced dependency on massive baggage trains could cause the legion to lag and make them targets for raids. A basic 4T-long pole with a crossbar served as the Roman soldier's knapsack. On this pole, soldiers hung their bags, which contained meals, shovels, water bottles, cooking implements, and cloaks. The Roman army permitted 1 pack mule each squad of 8 men, regardless of the weight each soldier carried. These mules carried camping gear, including tents. Colleague legionnaires provided progressive training phases for new recruits. First, they had to learn how to march. It was initially anticipated that trainee squads would march 20th miles in 5 hours and 40 minutes. They retook the tests with full armor and weapons 12 hours after they had mastered this without any equipment. A wooden post was the first thing a Roman soldier had to contend with. Regardless of the weather, training sessions were conducted outside. Using their gear or more substantial wooden training weapons intended to increase strength, soldiers rehearsed sword attacks against these posts. The weapon was thrown and received during PM training. The training pilum had a soft leather button at the tip, but otherwise was the same weight and length as a normal one. The pilum was thrown by recruits. Veteran soldiers frequently threw the training pilum at new recruits to test their skills, while others trained parrying it with a shield or sword. For agility training, there was a vaulting horse in every soldier barrack. The soldiers, fully armored and armed, practiced jumping over or onto the building. In addition to increasing agility, this activity helped identify slack or improperly suited portions of their armor structure. In order to keep the Roman legion strong in battle, drills were essential. Soldiers rehearsed shifting positions, such forming a defensive circle or switching from a line to a wedge. These exercises involved going forward, backward, and sideways at different rates, ranging from standing still to walking and jogging. Continual strikes may also result in soldiers losing their pay or being given menial duties like cleaning the restrooms or stables. Military mutatio, in which soldiers lost their rank or privileges for dozing off while on duty, was one of the other harsh penalties. During a campaign, duty frequently led to colleagues' deaths. Units that fled in battle might be forced to eat barley rations, typically animal fodder, or camp outside the safety of the camp's walls. The lowest rank in the Roman army was the munififex, a new recruit still undergoing training. Once trained soldiers became immunes divided into 2 groups, those with specialized skills, for example, blacksmithing or carpentry, and those performing general tasks. The most coveted and listed rank was the principalis, which included vital roles like watch rotation management or serving as second-in-command in workshops and granaries. Each century had its own barracks block. Within these blocks, Each concubinium squad was allocated its own space of about 100 square feet. This area was divided into a 50 sq ft sleeping quarters and a 50 sq ft living quarters. 8 men shared these spaces, where they could store their belongings, share meals, and gossip about the day's events. Roman soldiers were not allowed to marry when joining or during their service. However, commanders overlooked relationships with local women. Soldiers were often permitted to leave for, and the children born from these relationships could later serve the military in various capacities. Roman soldiers spent much of their time outside the camp engaged in duties such as escorting officials, constructing roads and bridges, guarding villages, performing convoy duties for merchants, or assisting other legions on campaign. Every soldier had to be adaptable to the changing circumstances outside the camp in order to maintain assignment fairness. Each soldier's daily tasks were carefully documented in legion records. Because of this approach, no soldier was unjustly assigned additional responsibilities or guard duties. The legion as a whole would leave the camp for simulated combat 3 times per month. These drills started with a 10-mile forced march and a cavalry charge. In order to improve their physical fitness and replicate war circumstances, the legion then practiced moving in different formations, frequently uphill. Soldiers used 40,000 pounds of forage, 12,000 gallons of water, and 18,000 pounds worth of grain when they weren't fighting outside the camp. For pack animals, daily, such extensive needs required efficient supply chains and careful planning. Ancient Roman sexuality was a complex and multifaceted subject deeply influenced by the values, laws, and social structures of Roman society. It wasn't governed by the same principles or norms as modern conceptions of sexuality with rigid labels like heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. Instead, Roman sexual behavior was largely defined by social roles, expectations of power and dominance, and the structure of family and state. Here we will explore various aspects of sexuality in ancient Rome, from marriage to prostitution to the roles of gender, and power, shedding light on how the Romans viewed sexual relationships. The foundation of Roman sexual morality was based on dominance and social status. A critical element in Roman sexuality was the power differential that existed in sexual relationships. The active and passive roles in sex were not necessarily determined by gender, but by social hierarchy and power. Ancient Roman sexuality was a complicated and multi-dimensional topic that was greatly impacted by Roman social structures, laws, and ideals. Roman sexual conduct was primarily shaped by social roles, expectations of power and dominance, and the structure of the family and state rather than being guided by the same principles or rules as contemporary views of sexuality, with fixed labels like heterosexual, gay, or bisexual. In order to shed light on how the Romans perceived sexual interactions, we will examine a number of topics related to sexuality in ancient Rome, including marriage, prostitution, gender roles, and power. Roman sexual morality was predicated on social standing and dominance. The power imbalance in sexual interactions was a crucial aspect of Roman sexuality. Gender did not always dictate the aggressive and passive roles in sex. Instead, social structure and power did. A guy of Roman descent, especially a freeborn citizen. This hierarchical perspective on sexuality produced a society where sexual behaviors were entwined with control and power. Marriage in ancient Rome was essentially a social and legal agreement rather than a sentimental or romantic one. Producing legitimate heirs, maintaining family lineage, and upholding the Roman state were the fundamental goals of marriage. The father had complete control over the household, including his wife, kids, and slaves, according to the patriarchal Roman ideal of marriage. In marriage, women's responsibilities were frequently limited to running the home, raising the kids, and maintaining the family unit. Roman women, especially those from affluent families, were expected to be chaste until marriage and faithful after marriage. Adultery was illegal for men, but only for women, as it could undermine the legitimacy of their husband's heirs. As long as it didn't cause political or social controversy, or cast doubt on the legitimacy of the family's heirs, marital infidelity was largely allowed. Slave or prostitute partnerships were the most prevalent type of extramarital sex for men. Adulterous women may be subject to heavy consequences, such as divorce or exile, and in rare cases, even severe punishments, such as imprisonment or incarceration. It's interesting to note that Roman men were also allowed to have casual relationships with women outside of marriage. These may include brief sexual encounters with slaves or prostitutes, concubines, or an official partnership without the rights of marriage. Even if some parts of male sexual behavior were accepted, the family's validity was in Roman society. Paramount prostitution was common and played a significant role in the urban economy. Legal and subject to governmental regulation, Luperia brothels were frequently found in busy areas of cities, such as close to theaters and bathhouses. It's interesting to note that, despite being viewed as morally dubious, prostitution was not illegal in ancient Rome. In fact, it frequently involved having sex with slaves, non-citizens, or people lower in the social hierarchy. These relationships were characterized by power dynamics and social dynamics rather than sexual orientation. For example, a Roman man could have sex with another man or boy, but it was expected of him to always be the dominant partner. The ideal Roman man was the one who exercised control and dominance in his sexual life. However, a Roman citizen who was pierced by another man was frequently despised. This was a reflection of the larger Roman ideals of pudor modesty and the manlin, which forbade anything that was perceived as undermining a man's masculinity in favor of women. Roman literature and law did not frequently record same-sex relationships, and they typically lacked legal validity. Sexual overtones were frequently present in religious ceremonies, particularly when fertility and agricultural rites were involved. Roman boys were often taught to master the art of sex from a young age, with an emphasis on being the dominant active participant. This was part of a larger cultural investment in masculinity and virility. Young boys were often encouraged to pursue relationships with slaves or prostitutes as a way to demonstrate their sexual maturity and prowess. Roman society also embraced sexual experimentation in some ways. There are references in ancient texts to the idea that a young Roman man could test his skills in love before entering into marriage. However, as men grew older and established their own families, they were expected to settle into more socially acceptable relationships. The institution of slavery played a significant role in the sexual life of ancient Rome. Slaves were often treated as property and were subject to their owners' sexual desires. Many slaves, especially in ancient Rome, had their sexuality deeply intertwined with social roles, power structures, and the broader cultural understanding of masculinity and femininity. Sexual practices, relationships, and behaviors in ancient Rome were defined by societal norms, legal regulations, and religious beliefs, but they also reflected the personal desires and dynamics of Roman life. Below is an expanded analysis of key aspects of Roman sexuality, covering 10 critical themes that defined sexual practices and perceptions in the ancient Roman world. In ancient Roman society and social status played a significant role in determining sexual roles. Roman men, especially those of high social rank, were expected to maintain dominance in sexual relationships. The active role in sexual encounters, which often meant penetration, were reserved for freeborn Roman men, while the passive role of being penetrated was generally associated with those of lower status, such as slaves or foreigners. The Roman concept of masculinity was bound to these power dynamics. A man's sexual behavior was a reflection of his status and strength, whereas being penetrated even by a woman was seen as a loss of Attilu's manliness. Marriage itself was not necessarily founded on romantic love, though affection between husband and wife was not uncommon. Adultery, especially by wives, was highly punishable in Rome, as it could jeopardize the legitimacy of offspring, the cornerstone of Roman society. Men, however, enjoyed much more sexual freedom, often engaging with prostitutes, slaves, or even other men without facing the same level of moral reproach as women. The Roman man was expected to maintain control over his household, while sexual relations outside of marriage did not necessarily threaten his role as paterfamilias. Prostitution was a widely accepted aspect of Roman society, despite its moral ambiguity. Prostitutes, often slaves or freed women, worked in lupanaria brothels, which were legally recognized and regulated by the state. These establishments were common in urban areas like Rome and Pompeii. Prostitutes came from various social backgrounds, including slaves and the lower class. Women, and even some highly educated Roman men, particularly those from the upper classes, frequented brothels, but they also kept mistresses or concubines who were not considered prostitutes. The state taxed both brothel owners and prostitutes, reflecting their recognition as an integral part of the Roman economy. There were also male prostitutes, pathi, who catered to the sexual needs of wealthier men, but were often seen as inferior due to their passive role in sex. Roman attitudes towards same-sex relations were far less focused on sexual identity than contemporary Western societies, instead viewing homosexuality through the lens of fixed identity categories. Heterosexual homosexual Roman sexuality was more focused on the active versus passive roles in sexual encounters of the freeborn. Roman men could engage in sexual relations with other men, provided they maintained the dominant active role. Roman society found it disgraceful for a citizen to take the passive role, which was associated with a feminized and a loss of manliness.
That's it for today. Remember to support our channel, please subscribe.